It's always interesting when journalists meet with people from the law community, because people in law and journalists, they just sort of love to hate each other. And yet there are so many similarities in terms of the work that we do. For example, the way we distill human experience, the ways that we do so are very strikingly similar. Because as you would know, not all facts provide evidence. No matter how true the experience or how established to be true a particular occurrence or experience has been, that does not necessarily qualify the experience to become evidence, carry the weight of evidence in a trial. Likewise, in journalism, not all information is news. But of course, all news is information. So we have this way of distilling information and human experience that's very different from the average layman or layperson. And that's an area of commonality that we sometimes do not capture. We have very similar concerns as well about a notion of justice. Social justice in particular, but not only social justice, all forms of justice. There is an answer to the question of what is journalism for, which goes along the lines of creating the condition, assisting in creating the conditions for improving the standing of human beings in their communities, in their countries, and in the world. And I think if you look at the role of law, you will find that there is a similar concern about bettering the human condition, ensuring that the conditions are there so that people can grow and they can develop. One of the very peculiar aspects, and that's something that's very common to both disciplines as well, is the fact that we believe somewhere along the lines in this notion of an objective reality or objective values, that we are able to distill from an experience or an occurrence, something that has happened, something that we can capture and present as objective value or as objective reality. I don't know if there are any philosophy students here. This lady is smiling, so perhaps she has a grounding in it. So we're not going to go into a very lengthy debate on it, but it's very fundamental to understanding of various professions. You would know that Plato, for example, argued very strongly in terms of what you would call an objective reality. That there is an ability within human beings to step away from everything that's going on around them and to make very dispassionate observations about what's happening. He stood very much on the opposite side of another guy called Protagoras, who predated him as a Greek philosopher, who basically said that because we are the representation of everything that's around us, and that we are in the world, very much so the world is also in us. So it's extremely difficult to represent what one would consider to be an objective reality. Yet our professions require us to make that kind of distinction. Now, I'm not saying that the actual working out of this or the practice has been flawless, as you would know. And that's one reason why we hate each other so much, while at the same time loving each other, because we understand the kind of demands upon us as professionals, which is that you often hear the argument that in journalism, there's really no such thing as an objective representation of something that happened, that has happened. And if you wanted to stretch that analogy back to what I just spoke about in terms of how the philosophers felt about this, then you would see that some of it indeed does make sense, and there really is no way of presenting objective values. Except that there are certain things that tend to be indisputable. And in journalism, and in fact in terms of report writing and in terms of even court judgments, there are certain things that are indisputable, such as when, the answer to the question, when. Now, if you wanted to be mischievous, you could stretch that to say, okay, it was 3 p.m. in Trinidad, and therefore it was 1 p.m. in Panama, and 2 p.m. and before that even in Belize, and you can skew it like that. So even in that, in answering that question, there is this relativism that you have to deal with. But in fact, it is pretty much indisputable that the time in Trinidad and Tobago today is, and not to the second, is 1:37 or something. So there are certain things that are indisputable, and that's why in journalism we focus on when. We also focus to a certain extent on, and which is the gist of what you're talking about, which is the what. What has happened? That is extremely important. One of the things I do is I teach business journalism, and if you look at a prospectus, for example, for an acquisition, which is something I'm looking at right now, with respect to Sagico and others, the document that they put out is something like this. And then you scan it and you look at it, and the question you keep asking yourself is, what the hell has actually happened? What has happened is easier to establish or to determine if there is a documentary support. Because as in law, likewise with journalism, there is this process of verification that's absolutely necessary. And there are very few things to essentially determine or to verify something that's equal to a document. So if you have the document, it might be case law. So if you're looking back at what a previous judgment said, it might be an invoice, it might be a receipt, it might be a document. So determining what really happened is more easily established by through documentary means. The other, even less reliable but often cited source of determining what really happened are people who saw what happened. So in the newspapers they say, oh, eyewitness reports, tra la 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 la. Now in this room right now, there are X number of eyewitnesses to this tragedy unfolding in front of you. This lady on my right is experiencing essentially the same thing as this lady on my left. She is probably noticing that I have a bit of a punch. This guy in front here is more difficult for him to notice that, right? Because I'm wearing this and then he's looking at me. So the vantage point, where he's coming from, is making a difference. And therefore his representation of what happened when tomorrow they say, boy, this fellow come will talk to us about journalism and so on. And you know, she's telling her friend, well, he has a bit of a punch and he's short and he has gray hair, right? And wears glasses. And he's saying, yeah, no belly, you know. And somebody else is making another observation. The lady up there is seeing more. So there is this thing in terms of perspective that we have to deal with. Now I know that there is a focus on article writing, but just laying the foundation here so that you consider all the things that need to be considered for you to have said that you have written about what you have to write about in a way that is as close to the reality as possible. But there's absolutely no way really, except for one or two indisputable things, that you can really say that this is what really happened. The other thing about what we do is that we rely very heavily on, in terms of our output, a level of professional mediation. Okay, so I'm a writer and I write for the Trinidad Guardian and other journals and news agencies. and it goes to an editor, and that editor is a sort of gatekeeper in terms of representing what I have written for presentation to an audience. It might be determined that some of the language that I use is not suitable for that audience, so there is a level of mediation, professional mediation of what I have done. In terms of the practice of law, you go to a court, and the judge or the judicial officer who is determining your matter, who is looking at it, is in a sense capturing what you have brought to the table and then distilling that and mediating upon it. And it's a term that's more used in that sense in journalism than it does in the world of law, because of course mediation to you would mean a little bit different if you talk about professional mediation. But in journalism there is this notion of the mediation of material, which leads me to a very important part of what I wanted to talk to you about in terms of preparing reports and writing and interpreting complex ideas that come to you and really presenting it for your audiences. As a publication committee and as people concerned about having your work and the work of others replayed to others or represented to audiences, you need to be aware of certain phenomena that are currently occurring. How many here have Facebook pages, Facebook accounts? Right? I'll be able to tell people ages because of this, right? Who is on Twitter? All right, here's the big one. Instagram. What? Well, he's an old fella, so he... What has happened since with the advent of social media is that traditional media have been required to start reframing their production, the products, the things that they produce, the messages that they transmit. And that has had an impact in very practical ways. Have you noticed that mainstream media, and I know that there's this big thing about, mainstream or what we describe as legacy media, that's in the past, and social media is going to take over. I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit to show how that is not standing the test of time, that assumption. But what has happened is that the output of social media is challenging traditional legacy media in terms of the mode of presentation. So it's becoming more visual, for example, and you need to bear that in mind in terms of people involved in promoting the work that you're doing and in publishing. Is becoming more visual. The presentation on photography is going to be heavily focused on that, I would reckon. So it's more visual, and it's not only visual in a static sense, but an increasing degree, it's focusing on video-oriented material. So if you look at the really smart legacy media outfits, newspapers, in the UK, in the United States, and to a much lesser extent here, but it's happening here as well, you'll find that in terms of their online presence, you have far more visual representations and multimedia components. So that whereas you might have been focusing on something that's text, in the middle of the text you might be given a link online and you can go to a video of the interview that's being quoted in a particular article. So that in a sense now is starting to reframe how we look at how we write these things. So the style of writing is changing, the style of presentation is changing because of this massive impact of social media. The problem or the challenge is capturing people's attention in social media in the face of the fact that in a single day you have something like 500 million photos uploaded to Facebook. you have something like 1.2 billion tweets. Might have that figure wrong. Probably a little over 800 million tweets. Those of us who stand on the press freedom and freedom of expression side of the game say, well, jolly good. Because let's see who can censor that. And we have presented people, some of my colleagues and I, who sort of like confront these things regionally and nationally. We sort of go Betty-Goaty to that because, okay, try to censor that. If you try to censor, it definitely means that you are targeting and you're looking at the 499,100,000 tweet rather than all 500 million, 800 million tweets. If you get my point. So that what you're doing, what you're basically coming up against is this vast outburst of information, pictures, and the information is it's news, it's gossip, it's propaganda, which people are these days calling fake news, but basically it's good old-fashioned propaganda presented another way. And that's what you're confronting, and that's what you have to that's what you have to bear in mind in terms of earning your share of eyeballs and ears and different senses that people apply when they confront your material. So it's extremely difficult, and therefore you need to pay attention to the fact that this is what you're up against, and perhaps what you also need to do is to recalibrate the way you have been approaching this issue of publication and publishing than you have in the past. Now I know in this part of the world we're tending to lag a little bit behind, so that you don't really find that academia is following suit. But there's people who are conducting all kinds of social research nowadays, and at the top of their minds is the manner in which they present the material that they are presenting. In the UK, for example, they do something called a confidence report on the media. And the 2018 report is only just out, and it helps answer this question of where is legacy media losing ground and where is social media gaining ground. And what it is essentially showing is that whereas in the past few years, in the last decade or so, legacy media was starting to recede into the background and social media was shooting ahead, what is happening now is that people are regaining confidence in traditional legacy media for a number of reasons we can discuss if you want. But it is happening. And up to this morning, The Economist had an article that looked at confidence levels in traditional media in the United States in the face of Donald Trump. Because of course you know that one of the campaigns of the political administration in the United States is that traditional media have really been presenting fake news, and for the reality you need to look elsewhere. And I think that followed a general global trend of people looking elsewhere as opposed to mainstream media for the truth, and we spoke about that a little while ago. What is being recognized now is that is receding somewhat. So in the Economist report this morning, they showed that all of the major US newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, and some of the big ones, they are actually experiencing a rebound in terms of their fortunes. Because you know, a lot of the newspapers in particular had started to show a lot of significant decline. So those are some of the things you need to bear in mind. I don't know what practical bearing is going to have in terms of your work, but certainly the guidelines would be, one, that communication, mass communication in particular, is focusing more and more on the visual as opposed to the textual, and that visual reinforcement for what you have written is becoming more and more important. People want to see. The younger generation is more attracted to things that they can see and recognize and interpret on their own, as opposed to somebody who is claiming to be smarter than you, writing something and saying, okay, read that. So it's like, you know, the old textbook thing, you know, and hopefully not too many